Greetings, bibliophiles, and welcome back to The Book Thing. This one is actually a couple of days overdue in that I finished the book several days ago, and I'm only really just now getting around to having a go at recording this. Although, having said that, I did actually try, not that long after I finished it, and then I wasn't particularly happy with it, but I was trying late at night, and I decided it would be best if I went to bed instead, so here we are several days later. So the book this time round was a much shorter one, hence there being much less of a gap between these book videos. It's called, alternatively, depending on where you live, either The Rolling Stones or Space Family Stone by Robert A. Heinlein. Now, this is one of his earlier books. This is from 1952, and this is one of his so-called juveniles, books that were written for a younger audience. And I actually read a whole bunch of these when I was younger, books like Starman Jones and Have Spacesuit Will Travel and Citizen of the Galaxy. But this one, which is, I don't know, I've had it in my own collection of books for a while. I don't know when I first read this. I don't know if this was back then or if this was a later acquisition from somewhere. It's almost certainly one I got from a charity shop. I mean, I barely remember where I get most of my books from, but it's an ex-library book. It's a 1970s edition. And if you're wondering, by the way, why the cover seems familiar, it's because it's this cover. That's where I got my channel icon from. I decided to take it from this particular book because it's also the wallpaper on my not terribly good mobile phone. It's just, I don't know, there's just something about this cover that it's like speaks to me of a certain kind of sci-fi from a certain kind of era. It's very nostalgic in a way. So I mean, nostalgic's a good word actually. A lot of this, the reason I like books like this is these are the books I read when growing up, and even though it's 1952, it's actually still pretty good sci-fi, even though also, it's a lot of people will have heard aimed at a younger audience and gone, oh, well, it's probably not very good then, or it's dumbed down or simplified or whatever. But this is Robert A. Heinlein. And moreover, it's Robert A. Heinlein before he got a bit weird with his later books. And it is actually pretty well written for what it is. And given that it was written in 1952, when we really didn't know all that much about space travel, it was all fairly theoretical at that point, it's surprisingly well written in terms of, it's based on what Heinlein knew and what people knew of, traveling between planets in that era. And looking back at it, you can look at things that are, omitted or just inaccurate, but it's based on what he knew and what people knew at that stage. And so you kind of have to forgive it a bit for that. But in other regards, it's surprisingly well researched. He doesn't do the usual thing of a lot of sci-fi of that era where they just get in a rocket ship and they just fly to Mars or wherever, and there's no problem with it. He actually goes into reasonable detail about how they have to compute the transfer orbits and the difference between transfer minimum. What would be the proper phrase we'd use these days? But the kind of the transfer orbits that require the minimum delta V, and then transfer orbits that are get there a lot quicker but take way more fuel. And there's probably actual terms for those that I'm just blanking on. But anyway, so having played a bit of Kerbal Space Program, some of this is now way more familiar to me than it would have been back when I first read these kind of books. And he also he sort of goes on about other things as well. I mean, there's again, you look at sci-fi in general and their conception of asteroid belts and fields, and it's all imagine Star Wars, dense tumbling fields of rock and spaceships dodging in around them. And he does not do that at all. He actually says, well, it's still mostly space. And the passage I'm going to read out in a little bit is actually to do with that. So as to the plot, well, it's actually reasonably simple. It's a really quite straightforward, fairly old-fashioned in some ways, just adventure. It's a fun adventure. And whereas oh god, I'm blanking on the name, Stand on Zanzibar, there we go, whereas that was quite a staccato book in nature, just lots of short chapters, this is a much more kind of traditional narrative style, broken up into chapters. And the actual book itself covers about 2 years, and there are several bits in the book where it just jumps forward by big chunks of time. But I mean, it's a shorter book as well, but I just got through it so much quicker because I could sit down and just read it faster, basically. It's not quite as choppy an experience as something like Stand on Zanzibar. Also, like I said, it is a much shorter book. It's only about 260 pages in this edition I've got from the 70s. So, we start off with the Stones, Space Family Stone, as the title, at least in the UK, was. And they are residents of the moon, or Luna, as they call it. And you've got... I'll basically run through the family, because it's fun. The interactions between the different family members, it's quite well written, because it's Heinlein, and it's just fun. So you've got the father of the family, Roger Stone, his wife, Dr. Edith Stone. You've got his mother, Hazel Stone, who's one of the founders of Luna City, and... it's not actually stated quite how old she is. At one point she claims to be in her 80s or in her 90s or something like that, and Roger Stone says, last week you said you were in your 70s. That's a quick bit of aging. She's quite a fun character. You've got the kind of protagonists even, but not really. It really is an ensemble cast. Castor and Pollux, the twins, or the unheavenly twins as they are nicknamed. You've got Mead, who is... I'm not actually sure if she's meant to be younger or older than the twins. And then you've got Lowell, the baby as they call him, who's like 5 or 6. He's by far the youngest. So basically they start off on the moon, and they've got this reasonably comfortable existence. And there's a kind of like... it's basically the twins kind of get things moving, and they end up getting itchy feet, as it were, and... decide that they're going to head out for Mars. And at first it's just like, well, we're going to go on a vacation, because they've been to Venus already, and they've never been, the other way. They've never been to Mars. And it's very 1950s in that, oh yes, we've colonized Venus. And of course these days we know that's basically impossible with current technology. It's just like, Venus is hell. It's actually interesting little science tidbit. Venus is actually the hottest planet in the solar system. You'd think it'd be Mercury, being right next to the sun, but no, it's actually Venus, and it's all because of that atmosphere. Anyway, so they head out to Mars, and they have various adventures along the way. One of the nice things is when they head out to Mars, they actually fall back to Earth first, and then burn in orbit around the Earth to boost their orbit out to Mars. And it's like, that's actually quite a sound bit of orbital, mechanics, or whatever you want to call it. That is one of the ways in which we get satellites and rockets to various places. Quite frequently, you'll get, we want to send something to Jupiter, for instance, but first we loop it in around Venus and use the slingshot effect to, gain a bit of, we steal a bit of the momentum of Venus to get a bit of momentum on the satellite. And it's all like, it's very solid stuff, surprisingly so, given a lot of what else was being written in the 50s. I mean, we also had people like, Asimov and John Wyndham, but they were not writing sci-fi like this. They were writing different sorts of sci-fi. So once they get to Mars, they have further various adventures, and at some point, the plan was, we're just going to head back to the moon. We're going to go back home. We've had a little holiday, and then the wanderlust kicks in, and they end up heading out to the asteroid belt instead. And then the last section of the book is set there. And it ends with them basically going, well, you know what? We've never been to Titan. Let's go to Titan. And they basically kind of... it ends in rather a nice way. I won't read out the exact ending, but it's kind of like, it's them and all the people that followed thereafter. And, it's one of these books where it's like, we need to go out. We need to, explore, and we want to explore. And it's sort of celebrating a certain mindset of humanity where people just, they have a need to see what's there. They have a need to push boundaries and go out and see all the new things. And it's sci-fi in that vein, but it's just fun. It's just a really fun book. And even though maybe some people would be put off by the slightly anachronistic nature of it in some ways. I mean, the rocket ships, for instance, are a very 1950s design. But in others, there's a whole kind of like sub-strand. Roger Stone's job, basically, he's a writer. He writes this really trashy sci-fi serial show that is completely taking the mickey out of a lot of the kind of the pulp sci-fi of the day, where it's all like lantern-jawed heroes and ray guns and evil villains that want to conquer the galaxy, and it completely takes the piss out of that. While at the same time, we look back at it and it kind of looks 1950s-ish, but it's different. It's just very different from a lot of what was around there. Now, it's actually interesting in that a lot of these characters actually made appearances in later Heinlein novels. And there's actually a list on Wikipedia. Hazel Stone, for instance, gets a look in later in a book called The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. And I don't think I've actually read that one myself. I've read a bunch of Heinlein, but not all of them. But that's kind of like, it's not about her, but she's in that book. Castor and Pollux also turn up in, The Number of the Beast and the Cat Who Walks Through Walls, which I have read that latter one. And Hazel's also apparently into Sail Beyond the Sunset. I don't think I've watched or read that one. And Lowell apparently is also in The Cat That Walks Through Walls as well. I didn't know that. Anyway, so yeah, it's just fun. It's just fun. It's a bit of fluff in some ways, but in others, it's this odd mix of like old-fashioned 50s sci-fi adventure, and then at the same time, it's taking the mick out of a lot of sci-fi of the day, like the Flash Gordon style stuff, and I don't know. A lot of the fun in it comes from the interaction of the family members and the various kind of scrapes they get into, and there's some moments of drama as well, but the whole thing is just it's just unlike a lot of the kind of like even stuff that's written for a younger audience, and Heinlein went out of his way to just not dumb it down, and you find that with the other juveniles as well, where he'll throw in a passage about calculus or how to use a slide rule or whatever. He wasn't writing down to his audience. It was for a younger audience, but it wasn't writing down to them, and it really did come across. So it's some good quality sci-fi, even if it does seem a little dated. So the passage I'll read is actually from fairly late in the book. This is when they are getting to the asteroid belt, and it's kind of indicative of some of the stuff I was saying earlier. The asteroid belt is a flattened torus ring or donut in space encompassing 13,500,000 million trillion cubic miles. This very conservative figure is arrived at by casting out of the family the vagrant black sheep who wander in down to Mars and farther, even down close to the sun itself, and by ignoring those which strayed too far out and become slaves to mighty Jove, such as the Trojan asteroids, which make him an honor guard of a guard of honor even 60 degrees ahead and behind him in orbit. Even those that swing too far north or south are excluded. An arbitrary limit of 6 degrees deviation from the ecliptic has been assumed. 13,500,000 million trillion cubic miles of space. Yet the entire human race could be tucked into one corner of a single cubic mile. The average human body is about 2 cubic feet in bulk. Even Hazel's dauntless hero, Captain John Sterling, would be hard put to police such a beat. He'd need to be twins, at least. Write down the figure as 1.35 times 10 to the power of 25 cubic miles. That makes it easier to see, if no easier to grasp. At the time the Rolling Stone arrived among the Rolling Stones of Rock City, the belt had a population density of 1 human soul for every 2 billion trillion cubic miles. Read 2 times 10 to the power of 21. About half of these 6,000 odds lived on the larger planetoids, Ceres, Pallas, Vesta, Juno. One of the few pleasant surprises in the exploration of our system was the discovery that the largest asteroids were unbelievably dense and thus had respectable surface gravitations. Ceres, with a diameter of only 485 miles, has an average density 5 times that of Earth and a surface gravity about the same as Mars. These large planetoids are believed to be mainly core material of lost Lucifer, covered with a few miles of lighter debris. The other 3,000 inhabitants constitute the belt's floating population in a most literal sense. They live and work in free fall. Almost all of them are gathered into half a dozen loose communities working the nodes or clusters of the belt. The nodes are several hundred times as dense as the main body of the belt, if dense is the proper word. A transport for Ganymede could have ploughed through the Hallelujah node and Rock City and never noticed it except by radar. The chance that such a liner would hit anything is extremely small. So apart from that sort of anachronistic view that the asteroid belt is composed of the jumbled up remains of a planet that just got smashed to bits, it's fairly solid stuff. It's not like it's got this grounding in reality, or reality as Heinlein knew it of that day, that just adds a little veneer of respectability to the whole thing. And it's just, I don't know, there's not a lot else like it. There really isn't, especially not from that era. So yeah, it's fun. I don't know if I'd necessarily recommend it. It would be to not maybe everyone's tastes, but it's the kind of thing that if you're looking for a light sci-fi read, it's good, and it will only take you a couple of days to get through. And some of other Heinlein's other juveniles were also quite similar, that they weren't heavy going at all. You could just plough through them, and they were just fun adventures, because that's what they were meant to be, is fun adventures. But like I said, he wasn't writing down to people. He was treating his viewers, why do I keep saying viewers? I'm used to saying viewers when I'm talking about doing YouTube and whatever. He was treating his readers as people that could understand things. He wasn't like baby talking them at all. So that's about everything I have to say about that, really. I'm not sure what I'm going to read next. I've got still David Copperfield. I'm like only a third of the way through that. It's entertaining in bits, but it's also quite hard going in some way. I can't seem to read much more than a bit at a time. It's not like this where I just sat down and ploughed through it in a couple of days. I might start reading something else in the meantime, and I might also make it another thing from my shelf, because if nothing else, doing these videos, it's been a great excuse to dig out some of the books on my bookshelf, some of the many books. I've probably got like 200 plus books around the house that I just haven't read in a long time. But I think I'm going to be quite conscious of not just like, I'm going to read all the stuff that I've not read in a while and it's all going to be 1950s stuff. And I don't know, I'll try and maintain a bit of variety in what I'm reading, and therefore what I'm going to talk about in future videos. So hopefully you have enjoyed this little look at a slice of 50s sci-fi, and if you have, you can hit the like button, leave any comments below, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.